I was like driving into work. I was going to buy some coffee, and I always get in trouble for buying like really expensive coffee. So is there a thing that when you have that excess money floating around that you spend it on? You know what I mean? Like I always got to get the best coffee. Cheap coffee, not for me. What's the thing that you got to spend that little extra money on?
Oh boy.
I know. I have to get on my soapbox for a second and say I support you. And I don't think that coffee is an extravagant expense. I get that
Exactly.
inflation has made it expensive, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying you just deserve it.
It's
not
a
an extra thing.
requirement.
It's a requirement.
It's a requirement. Okay.
Coffee's probably mine as well. I worked in a roastery during college, and so the snobbery was built right in. I didn't have a choice, and it's continued. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
I'll go with a good dessert. I'll say that. I think if you can get a premium, like even just simplify, just say a premium like ice cream or something to that regard, that's got some quality to it, I'll pay extra for that. Coffee's good, but yeah. That's
Dessert's a
not
good
to
one
be
too.
redundant. I'll go with the with the dessert treat category.
Nice.
I
What
like
about-
that coffee, dessert, and then mine's more of like, I really like purses. So I would buy like a really fancy purse
Yeah.
for me, but
That's great.
Now you're getting to the high end stuff. That's
Yeah.
all category.
I know.
Well,
Hey, we didn't
now that-
specify how much extra money. We just said
Right?
a little bit extra money.
Yeah, that's
Right.
true. That's true.
which reminds me that books go on this list as well, with the amount I have on my to be read list.
Those are also not an extravagance. It's just
necessity.
life necessissy.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't buy a lot of things. Hello, my name is Kelsey and I'm a shopaholic.
Yeah. This is a bad question for Kelsey.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe I shouldn't answer that one. But Tara, no, I 100% I agree with you, Wallace. Purses, maybe not because I carry everything in my hands like the evolved human that I am with small pockets. But sweaters, living in Minnesota, if I have extra money, you can never have too many sweaters. The limit does not exist.
That's
True
awesome.
story.
Cars, if we're going to go
Oh
to the
yeah,
higher end.
I
side
thought
of it,
you were
so
gonna
that's
say cars. I was
Keep
gonna
going.
say that. Yeah.
so
Or like chocolate for me too. Good high-end chocolate. Oh, so good. Fun. Well, today on our Tech for
tough to
Business
beat a
podcast,
Tesla. That's all I'm saying.
yeah, we're talking about budgets. We're talking about budgets. We're talking about money, and we're going to talk a little bit about hopefully how you can use your budget wisely, but something that we think if you ever have a little extra money should be spending it on, which is your IT. Tara, Kelsey, and I are joined by Kyle, our president and CEO, and Matthew, our VC. And when it comes to budgeting for IT, where do you even start? Where do you begin?
I can do the kind of the start and just kind of the general topic side, and we run into this with many cases talking to organization is they usually don't have an existing pretense of how much of their percent of their revenue side of that should really be set aside for technology. And there's a number of different studies out there. I mean, industry average on general non-regulated organizations is about 3%. Again, that's just a very standard number side of it. So again, the amount that you'd set aside could vary depending on the size and revenue of the organization. You get into healthcare and other regulatory sides of it, and Matthew, you can chime in on side if I remember all these numbers right, but around 7-8%. It's a much bigger number, just because of the amount of technology for compliance and regulatory reasons side of it. So you got kind of those general percentage numbers, and obviously it'll vary in between. The real world that I run into when talking to most organizations, it's whatever they've been doing in the past, so it's just a repeating of the general past or whatever then they're told that they have to do, whether it's from a regulatory of the, because of the industry again that they're in, or of a supported vendor or customer of theirs that they are regulated now because they're regulated, they're part of the overall food chain as you would for their supplier, or customer that they're trying to work with. So, there's then all of a sudden their budget changes and they're scrambling a little bit because it's more of a reactionary spend on those cases. We would generally advocate, again, to get in that proactive side of it, to adhere to just some general planning side of that. And planning is usually that first step to make the spend at least more predictable side of that. And then at simple level, it's hardware refresh, looking at your workstation servers and component sides and saying, I'm going to replace, typically we'd advocate that your workstations would be about a 5-year usable life, as well as your server sides of those. So just plan 1/5 of your workstations be replaced every year. And then your servers every 5 years. If you have multiple servers, stagger them, so you don't have it all refreshed at one time if possible. If you're in multiple servers, sometimes you have the actual hardware versus the software virtual servers. So there's a little more logistics to it, but the general name of the game there is try to spread the expenditures out, but they're coming, so you can plan in advance, and what your annual subscriptions are and so forth. So predictability is a big part of the game to keep the costs in check, so you're not surprised by a $20,000 expenditure that you weren't planning on. That's for sure what we try to avoid, because those are painful.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything you've said there, Kyle. It's all about, in what have you been spending previously and why have you been spending it, right? We can look at what they spent a year, 2 years, 3 years. And generally, obviously, we work with a lot of nonprofits, and I've had experience previously. There does tend to be a little bit of less awareness of maybe exactly what's in place in the smaller nonprofits, though it's easy to lose track of what you have everywhere. So my recommendation is kind of tying in with what Kyle said. Make sure you know every piece of technology you have, and then make that definition of how long you're going to have before you replace it. And your budget is based around that process. If you're doing this at that level and you're doing it with your computers being under warranty and then your servers being under warranty, the replacement of those devices often is going to fall under having the part replaced if it's breaking early, or fully replacing the device so it's under warranty again. It significantly decreases your unexpected costs. And unexpected versus expected costs is exactly what the budget comes down to. You can't be consistent if you aren't aware or expecting anything to go wrong. And that's the other thing that I tend to see, is that there's this kind of hope of it's working now, it'll keep working. And we can't do that. that's where it gets a little dangerous.
Yeah, the days when your server is 10 years old is that can be a very expensive replacement. Why you avoided some expenditure sides of it can be very painful when it's unplanned. And labor is typically, when deploying new solutions, is one of your most expensive components. That'll far exceed the actual cost of the what you're acquiring in a lot of cases, sides of that. So anything you do that's planned and organized is going to be far, far cheaper. And so whatever you can get in a proactive stance and align your budget properly side of it, and just plan accordingly, is going to definitely help control your overall IT costs. Reactionary is just very expensive. Very expensive.
Yeah. There's the amount of time, the amount of extra cost that goes into getting something deployed same day, next day, within a week, so that you can keep operating, is exponentially bigger than the amount to say, oh, we have to be down for a week because of a big change. You can plan ahead for it. You aren't having to cancel appointments that were scheduled or cancel things that were already in place. I mean, that's the biggest part, is trying to be proactive versus trying to be reactive about it. Trying to not just plan, but also say, we know this is going to happen, or we know that something will occur, and you can plan for unexpected events in a similar way of what will we do if something breaks that we're not expecting to break? Should we have a spare on hand? Should we have a second location we can go to? I'm instantly falling into the incident response side of things, and I need to stop that. But there's so many things that can go wrong, and that's where I tend to live with the work that I do. But when you're planning for that budget, you can have those thoughts because you've already covered the basics of, wait, which machines are the most important? Like, if our director's laptop dies, is that more critical than the one that we tend to print from in the office? Probably.
Yep.
And those same replacement policies and putting together that budget, not even putting together a budget, I think putting together just an asset list, putting together a data location list, putting together a software list. This goes in with what you said before, Kyle, about once you have those things, you can say, well, this software costs X amount a year. This hardware needs to be replaced every 5 years. This data is in a location that we need to move because we don't like where it is right now, or we want to put it in the cloud eventually. That asset list, as well as being a huge compliance requirement for basically every compliance that can run through my head when I'm saying this, is where I personally start when I'm talking about budgets. I know it gets a little bit more granular and there's ways to do it that are quicker, but I feel like for me, at least, that list is where I go before I begin to have that conversation, because otherwise there's too many unknowns.
Yeah, it's just, it's really just organizing, getting all organized so you can actually, assess where you need to go with it. Because that planning is just so paramount side. It kind of lends in when we talk about the nonprofit side. One area we discuss with many nonprofits, because obviously, the dollars are limited typically. They need to be very cognizant of the spend side with it, and they don't always have necessarily the consistency of a revenue stream because they're not necessarily selling anything. They rely on grants and other things. Programs from Microsoft and Google and these vendors, they have nonprofit programs with nonprofit licensing that's very, very cost effective side of it. And many of them, for example, when you talk about, understanding your data location, you can leverage the cloud, file storage systems on their sides and now eliminate the spend of, say, an on-premise file server, which then also, opens up, better security and better functionality side of it. But many organizations, again, just haven't taken that stop to plan that side. Once then now you can leverage, and now you're that one spend with that lower cost licensing side, you just leverage it even further. And you get into these packages like 365 and those other components. There's so many tools and services there that could replace what you're probably paying for in another aspect. So you're kind of having that extra spend that you can ultimately eliminate. So now you're just that much more efficient as well. So that lowers your IT spend.
Yeah, I had that exact conversation with a friend who came to me for some advice not too long ago. Their current IT was recommending that they replace their entire server system, update their entire local network. They had completely disconnected buildings, and so they were going to have to get some site-to-site
VPNs.
No, it was I'm forgetting the term, which is great. Basically, radio signal Wi-Fi connections.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
like a wireless bridge.
A wireless bridge. That's the one. Yes, they were. They're quite remote. To make sure that they had the full LAN in the other locations, and they had internet at every building. They didn't need that, and I recommended they just look into what would happen if they moved everything up to their Office 365 environment that they already had. We were nearing a 6-figure save on their expenditure when it came to hardware, deployment costs, training costs for their staff, because it's important to keep that in mind when you're changing your environment as well. It was a big saving for them, all because their current IT just didn't really have someone in place to have that conversation for them, which I think for me is kind of a large part of this as well. Generally, you maybe have someone on site, maybe you do have an internal IT person, but they're good with the hands-on side of things, right? They're good with making the computers run again, making sure the network's up, fixing the internet if it's broken. Maybe they're fantastic with the software you use as well, right? They're significantly saving you money. But the business side of things, how that works for the organization, is such a different mindset. I can still remember the moment that an old CEO said to me and like pointed that difference out, and I felt my brain break a little bit as I went from thinking like an engineer to thinking like someone who was like business minded in that way. And that is where I think we see the most of this cost savings coming from. Because if you aren't planning ahead, if you've got someone who is just fixing things as they break, you can't have that planning in place because you're not thinking about an upfront cost to save money in the future. It's more about trying to keep those costs low total, which makes sense until something breaks and you're still spending the money you would have spent before, and it will break, I think is what it comes down to. There's no way to avoid that.
Yeah, and it'll break at the worst possible time too. It generally just will. The other aspect side when you're talking about your situation and going to 365 with the data side of it, the other cost and the other benefit side is when you talk about your incident side, you're like a disaster recovery, any kind of those other sides, the cost of backup and those other things that also, are areas that are probably not addressed in many cases, but should be. So now if you try to address it and you haven't embraced some of these other types of services side, now you got those additional costs coming in. So, not only do you get the benefits of simplifying your infrastructure side of it, now you enable other capabilities you just didn't flat out have, that would even cost you more. So there's multiple rewards, but again, it all comes back to really understanding first, where you're at, and then you can make much better planning decisions, and that extra time up front, will really pay a lot of dividends versus the, being on the, I always call that technology treadmill. It just kind of feels like you just kind of are just continuously just replacing what we're doing, and you tend to run with the methodology. Well, it's working. We don't have a lot of challenges or problems, so we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Where at some point there's a benefit to stop and pause and assess, just because technology changes so fast that we were having the conversation the other day that if you're replacing a server that's 5 years old, and now you're going to put another one in, now you're talking about a 10-year span between those two. 10 years in our field is a lifetime, so you really, I think, have to reassess holistically how you're leveraging your technology before you make that next 5-year spend, because at the end of that 5 years, it's probably not going to be the right solution if you're replacing in a lot of cases, or you may not want to just do like for like. You may want to start embracing other aspects of certain cloud technologies, other areas where you potentially outsource, other ways where maybe make a partial spend there now and start looking at some other ways, so you start making the steps in the right direction. But again, can't do that unless you stop and take a holistic planning session and really say, how are we using technology? What do we really needed to do? What else is out there? Is there a better way to handle this? And I know you'd love to talk about the cybersecurity risks and all the other side that definitely come into those conversations, that you just need to find ways to mitigate risk, quite honestly. And technology now needs to be part of the conversation, because legacy IT, if you call it that, on just having systems on site and doing those things, there's a lot of risk footprint there that you may want to assess that you don't want to have, going forward.
Yeah, and you've reminded me of something from a previous organization. Basically, there was an organization, a nonprofit, we were coming in to assist, and we found out during our assessment that they had someone who was assisting them, and basically volunteering for them as their IT was a full network administrator for a large organization nearby. And they were basically, when their servers were being replaced, they were providing these servers to the replacement ones to the nonprofit for free, as a way of allowing them to kind of upgrade their hardware consistently. Very kind of them, really nice. One of the things that we found from that, though, was that the hardware that was being replaced and put in was continuing to run the software or the operating system that was in use previously, which meant that the software they were getting, the OS they were getting, was at minimum 5 years old. And on top of that, the technician that was offering their time, while a fantastic technician from everything I've seen, did have a proclivity for older server versions. So this occurred in around 2017, I want to say 2018, and they were running server 2008, which at that time already we knew was not doing very well. So we're instantly in a position where we need to have a conversation around, hey, there's a lot of security flaws in this version. At the very least, you need to upgrade to revision 2, which they hadn't done. And then on top of that, we need to talk about what security features you don't have in place and what you need to have in place. And that was just at I've opened this computer up and can see exactly what it's running, and that fills me with dread. I hadn't run any scans. I hadn't done any security checks yet. I was just afraid. That is something that you can't be aware of if it's not really a priority. And I know that it seems like it's not. You've got a situation in place that's working for you. These things are happening, but having that kind of, a new set of eyes come in and review it at any time is always good. It's also a kind of it's a necessity. Wow, I'm really struggling today. It's a necessity of a lot of the compliance world that you have third-party assessments, vulnerability scans run. These types of things are, to be honest, expensive. If you have those compliance requirements, you'll know, and you should be meeting them. But they are something that can be planned for and mitigated. One of the things I used to offer clients when I was working as a technician was a basic rundown of the software they were using, and then comparing it with what I knew from everything I saw every day working for an MSP with what the most up-to-date and current version of the software on the market was. And often we'd find that someone was still running Sage 2008, which is great and did its job, but also isn't as helpful as it could be now. And then we see solutions like QuickBooks Cloud. Maybe it's not the right solution for you, but there is definitely places where it's a fantastic solution and significantly cuts down on what you need in Office, right? In the same way that moving to Office 365 can. Reviewing that is not something like you said, Kyle, that many nonprofits do, because if it's working, we want it to keep working.
Yeah, it's just not. It's not a priority side with it.
Yeah,
I use the analogy with a customer situation the other day. Side with it was around the wellness check at a doctor. Just because we all go to the doctor periodically, or we should. You do a wellness check. Just because even though you feel okay, there may still be something that you need to address or be aware of. So you go in and talk to the doctor, and they do some additional scans and whatnot to determine side of it. And they may say, hey, you need to cut your cholesterol is high, or these other things you can't see, but could definitely turn into a much bigger problem if you don't address. And that's similar to your bringing in a third-party assessment or review side of it, and just getting a periodic review or opinion side of it, because even though your old software, your old servers may be running fine now, that doesn't mean that you're not putting yourself in a situation for, a very unexpected event. And that's really what we're trying to advocate for, because then it gets back to that reactionary side of how painful, and the timing of that's never going to be ideal. It's not going to be going into a long weekend. It's going to be when you need to, run. If you're in a manufacturer, it's going to affect your production. It's going to affect the productivity of all your workers. You're going to, it's going to be, a very unpleasant situation. It's going to be expensive just because emergency dispatch fees, and you're going to have to make reactionary spends, which again get really expensive, and probably at the end of the day, you don't put you in the best situation when you come out of it either. You're probably no better off than you were when it all started, because you're just trying to recover. So there's just all kinds of reasons to say, why it appears on the surface to be saving money. It's really not. And you may get, I hate to use the term lucky, but you could get lucky and not have the problem, but the likelihood, the odds are not in your favor. And they become less and less in the cybersecurity world, just because any vulnerability seems to be on display across networks now. So they tend to get exploited. If they're there, they will be. So it's just become too simple for them to do it. So that's why we're so strongly advocating against putting in things that just have a large risk footprint to them. Just it's not worth the impact of the business. And I tend to see that often where, again, we have technicians that are part of the organization side of it, do great jobs with supporting the users. They're connected. They run the application sides of it. But unfortunately, in many situations, they put value into, saving $5 on a monitor, or, buying, refurbished or used, desktops because they're saved them $75 a desktop. So they tend to devalue labor and time, and they also tend to have some disconnect on the business impact side of that to productivity and the cost of labor if that is not working. So we've come into situations where that they've replaced the workstations, but they're replacing them, to your point, with 5-year-old workstations. So what was now a 10-year-old got replaced with 5-year-old. So yeah, they're 5 years newer, but they're still, by all practical purposes, slower by modern standards. And users' productivity is affected by it. And the users tend to be upset because it's slow. It's tend to be underpowered by modern standards with it. And although it was looked at by the person making the purchase decision was somebody who valued themselves by saving, again, $75 a desktop. Well, that $75 gets lost on a daily basis in productivity. So the multiplier is pretty huge in what it usually winds up being. So, unfortunately, it's not all places, of course, but we see those scenarios. So that's where the business owners need to be, and the C-levels need to be at least involved and understand and say, I don't want you to cut costs. I want predictability and I want equated value, but I'm not going to reward you on trying to cut corners on the cost, because that isn't necessarily going to give you the lowest cost IT. That's just not part of the equation.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that, and I say the classic IT trope, which is that person who can fix anything that's kind of given to them and does work for the organization and resolve that, and that is a fantastic skill to have. But one thing that I think's been true ever since IT started is that the role of IT was always partially undervalued. On top of that, it was definitely underexplored in terms of what the scope of it was. And we see this now with what it's become. We don't just have a service technician trying to do everything. We have service technicians, and we have our network administrators, and we have our cabling team, and we have the security side of things, which alone is 4 different departments. It's one person trying to do all that means that they are either overextending themselves or probably not able to dig in as deeply on some of these things as they may want to, or could be able to if they had more time to really focus on it. And I think that's where those types of mistakes get made. Trying to save $5 here because you think that's going to be more useful than replacing it with one that's long-term comes from having that technical side of things rather than the business-minded side of things. I still remember a manufacturing organization that I was working with where I advocated harder than I ever have before for them to replace their workstations, which at the time were just a hodgepodge of whatever they'd been able to pick up. I found machines that would meet the minimum requirements for all of their software and got the owner to upgrade his machine only to begin with. By the end of his first week with that machine, they'd ordered brand new machines for everyone on the executive team. By the end of that second of the week they had their machines, we were replacing every single workstation in the business. And like you said, Carl, it's productivity. If you're using these machines that are 5 years old, it may take you 5-10 seconds a click to get to something. And everyone's just accepted that. But it doesn't have to be. If everyone's saving down to a second or half a second just to get something done on a server because it is finally running at the speed it's recommended to be running at, you're saving hours a day. And you can't see it until you try it, and until you have that perspective of the way I sold it was to say, well, here's how quickly my machine can do it. And just seeing that distinction was enough for him to say, let's try it.
Yeah, that productivity measurement is huge. Again, it kind of gets lost in just focusing on just the technology application alone, saying, well, we'll run. Well, there's a difference between running and running right. So that's definitely a running optimal for the business side of that. And there's a different spend. So, typically when we're looking at it, we recommend, find the right size device for the organization side. You probably have a few multiples depending on the type of business work that they do. And then, set aside a X amount of budget. Say you have some $2,500 machines, you have some $1,500 machines, you may have some $4,500 machines, a couple of those for your power users, sides of those. But, create your budget, how many you're going to have every year. And, when it's only 1/5 of your desktops or endpoint side of it, tends to be a very manageable spend. And you spread that over the course of that year, even so quarter over quarter over quarter, not only are you spreading those costs outside of it, you're also, you're lessening the impact of the organization, because you only have 1/5 of the workforce is being impacted by a hardware replacement cycle side of that. So your productivity lot, because you will have some productivity impact while their machines are being replaced. Well, I would say the technology is getting much better, so even that's been minimized, but there's still some. And as well as it keeps, if when you have on-site IT or partner side, calls to the support desk after the migration is limited as well, because you got a much smaller subset. So there's a lot of reasons to advocate and do that. But now it's predictable. Everything's current, and tends to be support is far more reliable. As Matthew was mentioning on the warranty side of that, you get the newer hardware. Again, it's not as much wear and tear. So there's a lot of good reasons, and ultimately will lower your IT spend. And the only other thing I was going to add on the internal side that we see this come up from time to time is the use of just open source or free software side of that. And I know that tends to be attractive in a lot of cases. And why I love technology, and I love Linux, and I love a lot of those things. It's not something I would advocate for to put in production. And the main reason why is that it tends to be built by the person who built it has all the knowledge, and you're relying on that individual now for your sole line of support. And if that individual is on vacation, unavailable, you're just very limited in your support access, which will ultimately impact the business in a negative way. So whether, if you're looking at open source phone systems or firewalls or servers, of those things, it's just, you can't put an SLA around it. You don't have a commercial support line to go to, I would advocate against it in a commercial environment. I think it's great for learning. I think it's great for, personal use side of that, to experience with technology side of that. And you tend to see those open sources get integrated into commercial applications. And when you do, and you have a commercial support line with a vendor line and a guaranteed SLA with live support, then I think having that in a commercial environment is where you want to be. But without that, I would strongly caution businesses to reconsider, because while it seems like a low cost up front, the impact of the business again can affect the productivity in a huge negative way.
Yeah, I feel that the times I most often see open source or those custom solutions in place, it's because of that kind of undervaluing of IT. Again, the person who implemented it said, I can do that for cheaper than this commercial solution that does the same thing. And then they do it without documenting it. Obviously, sometimes they do, not calling anyone out. But generally, it tends to be less documented than you'd hope if that person was away. And I think that kind of ties in with the last thing I wanted to add as well, which is that one of the things I learned when I was getting into the network side of things was that a lot of the organizations I worked with, and this is obviously not true of everyone, it was just true of some of the organizations I worked with, really thought of themselves as X type of organization who has computers. despite the fact their computers did every part of their job for them. They didn't use paper anymore. It was everything is documented on the computer. And at that point, you are at least partially a technology company. And you need to treat that technology the same way you treat every part of the business. It needs to be as important, because if they fail, you're losing that productivity. You're losing bottom line every minute that machine's down. When it comes to the nonprofits, I think that is again, it's different for everyone. But if that's something that seems to resonate with you, then think about how it is that the organization views itself. Are you a nonprofit that supports XYZ and then also has to have computers? Or are you a nonprofit that uses computers to complete your mission? And if that's the case, and most likely it is, make sure that you're giving it the same priority you give other things that help you complete the mission, like your other employees, like the business, like the building that you have. Every part of that process is just as important. And that, in those times when I've seen that shift occur, it has very quickly changed the way that I've been able to supply the best value, because we're no longer arguing about, I want to say, the little things of, a $5 here or there, because we're talking about long-term goals to make sure that the organization is the best it can be to meet that mission.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think that's probably a good way to wind it up. I think very well said. I think that take some time and recognize the value and take in the soft costs, if you would, is a big part of the equation.
Yeah. I think the longevity of your company, your nonprofit, your business is important to remember when considering your IT and everything you're putting into that. So, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Kyle and Matthew, for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, comment. If you have a question or a topic, if you want to hear more about budgeting and sort of the admin side of IT, please reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website at cit-net.com/podcast.